Hello, everybody. This is Vincent, membership chair for the Canadian Club of Calgary. I am also on point as the technical support person for this Zoom event with the Canadian Club of Calgary. So we're using Zoom. We'll also be using the feature called Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions during the session with Dr. Megan McElheran or Kelly Blackshaw, pre-populate that so that and add in your questions as we go along so we can ask them during the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to promote Susan and Sally. So give me one moment. There we go.
Hello. Good morning and welcome to the Canadian Club of Calgary March virtual presentation. I'm Susan Jolliffe, co-chair of the speaker committee, and I'd like to start our presentation today with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories in Alberta of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. Today, our presentation, Mental Health in the Time of COVID, will be in a discussion format with our two speakers, Dr. Megan McElheran and Kelly Blackshaw. Dr. McElheran is a clinical psychologist and CEO of Wayfound Mental Health Group. Megan works with members of the community of first responders who have experienced traumatic events, involving work with the Canadian Forces, RCMP, firefighters, and with medical personnel. Kelly Blackshaw is a virtual healthcare expert and brings over 40 years of experience in healthcare innovation to Wayfound as their Vice President of Business and Development. Kelly has a passion of helping people live their healthiest life and building healthy communities. With over a year of COVID and living this way, our topic today is of special interest and concern to all of us. Please welcome today's presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just wait for Kelly to join me. Not sure if maybe Kelly's having a few technical challenges. I'll just fill the space while we wait for her by saying, there she is. Hi, Kelly.
So sorry. Yes, didn't think I'd have a technical problem, and here I am. But good morning. Thank you.
That's okay. Yeah. Hi. I just wanted to give a special shout out, as I know that Sally was working on how to pronounce my last name, and you did it perfectly. So thank you very much for that wonderful and warm introduction. I'm so honored and humbled to have been asked to be part of this today. And thank you for welcoming me and my incredible and esteemed colleague, Kelly Blackshaw. We're very excited to be here with you.
Yes, and I completely echo those comments. Megan, we call her Dr. Megan because she's amazing at the work that she does and for the community. So I'm so excited to be here as well to share with you some of the information and knowledge that she has around this very important space today. So we're going to actually do it in a bit of a format like an interview format, if you like. So I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Megan, and she's going to give us some of the answers, and then we'll give you certainly the opportunity to ask some questions as well, but we'll give you some coping strategies along the way. So we thought we'd start today with a bit of a personal reflection, and Dr. Megan's going to sort of ask you a question today.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So one of the things that we sort of did in preparing for today's talk was just really take a bit of a landscape review of, where are we in Canada relative to mental health, particularly a year into the pandemic, and found some recent statistics from the Canadian Mental Health Association that tells us that pre-pandemic, 8% of Canadians rated their mental health as poor or fair, whereas now a year in, we're actually looking at a 3-time increase of that. So 24% of Canadians, almost 1 in 4 Canadians are rating their mental health as poor or fair. Where we were at 69% saying good or excellent, we're now at 46% of folks rating their mental health in that way. So what we'd like to do, and one of the things that I'm going to speak about today in my talk is one of the things that has been so challenging about the pandemic is that for all of us in lesser and greater ways, the pandemic and the incumbent restrictions and the ways we needed to social distance and ultimately isolate really took away our agency. It really sort of robbed us of our sense of being able to be in control of and sort of take action purposefully in our lives, because we had to follow the public health recommendations that were necessary to protect the health of Canada and beyond. But that's a really powerful psychological experience for someone to go through. And my hypothesis, and I think some of what the literature is telling us, is that that is a significant contributor to why we are seeing such increase in sort of just general mental health outcomes that are being reported by typical Canadians. So what we wanted to do to start today was just invite you. There's no right or wrong answer to this. There's certainly no judgment. This is more so just about starting off in a very self-assessing kind of a way. Just check in with yourself and ask yourself, how would you rate your mental health today? Would you call your mental health poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent? And as you're doing that, you might consider, if you are rating, wherever you're rating your mental health, you might sort of consider asking yourself, what is it that I think that is contributing to the rating that I'm giving myself? And as we go along with our talk today, as Kelly mentioned, we're going to try and give you some ideas and some interventions that you can take away wherever you're at on that sort of continuum of how you reported your mental health.
Perfect. Yes, everybody, I think that's a great way to enter into this conversation, is checking in with yourself. So thank you for that. But one of the questions that we had for you, Dr. Megan, is what would you consider normal or typical for people to be experiencing this time of COVID that's different from maybe 20, 30 years ago?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So, we simply know there's been a lot of survey and census data that's been gathered over the course of the last year. And we certainly know that for folks who pre-pandemic were already struggling with maybe symptoms of anxiety or a depressive condition, that COVID and the experiences of COVID have worsened that for folks. We also know that for folks who were psychologically pretty healthy prior to the pandemic, that actually most people have reported or experiencing some degree of worsening in terms of feeling more anxious, feeling more stressed, feeling more depressed. And in fact, there's a recent study that came out that actually told us that, generally speaking, asking people right now how they're doing from a mental health perspective, you're going to hear more stories from the average Canadian saying, I'm feeling a little bit more anxious. I'm feeling more uncertain about my future. I notice my mood is a bit lower than it used to. I'm noticing that I'm feeling more stressed about kind of just the world and where our, sort of our future is headed. And certainly a lot of fatigue with the pandemic. There's a real sense of, there's that great saying of when you're going through hell, keep going. And we're sort of living that right now, is that we're a year in, there's a lot of fatigue, a lot of, questions about kind of when are things going to get back to normal, whatever that means. And that's pretty natural for folks to be experiencing. We are understanding that actually in our clinical space as psychologists and psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, we're actually looking at a new diagnosis called the COVID stress syndrome, which really is a form of anxiety that we are seeing people develop that is specifically related to COVID, potentially experiences with COVID, whether that's actually contracting the virus itself, or perhaps caring for or witnessing someone who's been impacted by the COVID-19 virus. So, we're just anticipating that. And I think one of the things we wanted to sort of highlight and bring into this conversation is that that's a really natural and normative reaction for all of us to be having, right? So if you find, as you did your self-assessment, that you are feeling like maybe your mental health is not that great, that maybe you're more so on that poor or fair end of things, what I really want you to understand is that that's perfectly natural and understandable given the context and the circumstances we have all faced in the past year. When we talk about, I'm a trauma therapist by trade, and when we talk about trauma, we talk about traumatic events being, and the kind of the symptoms and the reactions to traumatic events being a normal or natural reaction to an abnormal set of circumstances, which is exactly what we've been experiencing with the pandemic. There's been lots of what has happened with the pandemic that has been traumatic for all of us, again, to greater or lesser degree, depending on your family circumstance or occupational reality. But we just have to understand that there's a natural wearing away on our sort of mental health and mental resilience that we've all experienced. And I think it's important for us to understand that, because when we name something, when we can potentially normalize or validate something for ourselves, oftentimes that actually is part of what starts to take us down a journey of healing and recovery. Thanks, Kelly. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. The next question is really more about your work and we're around first responders. So this is the niche of the Wayfound for the most part, but first responders, and we certainly thank them for their incredible dedication to the helping others and the difference they're making out there. But what difference are they experiencing, say, relative to what we might be experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, and I really appreciate being able to speak to the work that our first responders are doing across the country, because they really, they keep things afloat for us. We have an understanding that just outside of the times of the pandemic, that actually our current rates of mental health conditions would tell us that almost 50%, so 44.5% based on recent statistics, of first responders in Canada would be meeting criteria for at least one mental health diagnosis. So, we call these operational stress injuries, or refer to them as psychological injuries in the public safety world or the first responder world. And the fact is that probably 1 out of every 2 first responders right now is struggling with symptoms of some kind of a mental health condition, oftentimes post-traumatic stress disorder related to the traumas that our firefighters and police officers witness in the line of duty. But also other kinds of psychological conditions like depression and anxiety conditions and addiction struggles and things like this. And there's a much greater understanding now in the first responder mental health world that, the work that our first responders do is very, very psychologically difficult. We kind of have this awareness or this understanding that they have physically demanding jobs, right? Working shift work, and lots of times they have to do very sort of feats of strength, if we think of our firefighters or something like that. But in equal measure, I think we need to understand as a Canadian society that there's just as much risk of psychological injury. And the psychological injuries are really tough because they're not visible, right? They're not wounds that can be easily seen and understood, by the community. And so sometimes there can be this misunderstanding. When we think about the pandemic, we have to understand that, I talk to paramedics and firefighters and cops all week long, and we'll hear stories about how, a paramedic that I'm working with, he got a call having to attend a domestic incident in the middle of the night where it sounded like somebody was not doing very well, and, had to go into a basement at 3 a.m., not really knowing what was on the other side. And also there's a worry or an uncertainty about, has this person, do they understand if they've had exposure to COVID? Are they demonstrating COVID symptoms? Have they reported those appropriately, right? And so, if they go in and they find out actually, yeah, there could be some COVID risk, they have to pull out. Even if there's a sort of a crisis or an emergency going on, they have to pull out and go and gown up and suit up and make sure that they are protecting themselves to go back in, right? So, you can think about our first responders are so, driven by a motivation to be of service, and it is so impactful on them when they are not able to save or help someone who's in crisis. So you can just think about the impact of, either having to take that extra moment to put on protective gear and make sure that they are protected, or whether they have to kind of retreat back and do that, even when they've got to the scene of a critical incident. And just that impacts the stress and the pressure, right? And certainly, one of the great worries that a lot of the first responders, that I work with have is, well, what if I get this and I take it home to my families, right? Like we're going out, we're transporting people with COVID to hospitals. We're going into, care situations where maybe there's been an outbreak of COVID, whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of risk of exposure, and there's a lot of fear about, typically the first responders I work with are saying, well, I can deal with it if it's me, right? If it's only me that it's impacting. But if I brought this home to my spouse or my children or so on and so forth, right, there would be a tremendous amount of guilt and regret about that. So I think, again, normalizing and understanding, we need to really understand the struggle that I think we've all been going through and the very natural sort of mental health erosion that we've all experienced during this last year. And then really kind of take that extra moment of pause to recognize that, the people who are turning up at our door at 3 a.m. in the morning, they also have this incredibly sort of significant risk and degree of psychological pressure that they experience that's, far away from what I experience in the course of a typical day.
So Dr. Megan, great answer. And we certainly must respect and feel really proud of the people that serve us, in that respect. But if they're at 44.5%, what the general population is approximately what, if you looked at that?
Yeah, sure. So if we just look at something like post-traumatic stress disorder, so in our first responder population, again, we're sort of over the 40% threshold, 40, 45, something like that. Typically in general population, we're looking at less than 2%. So it's quite a significant difference between what we would expect for our, general community members and the first responders who are serving our communities.
Yeah, significant difference. So that sort of brings us to that next question is, well, how do we cope? So can you give us some coping strategies in certain areas that would that everybody would value
Benefit from? Yeah,
Yes, benefit.
absolutely. So, the exercise that we started with of having you sort of check in and reflect on where your mental health is at, in addition to kind of orienting you to today's talk and kind of getting you connected to that, that actually is also introducing you to a bit of a tool or a strategy that I would recommend that you take away. Something that we're trying to accomplish in the mental health industry as a whole is really trying to move people into an understanding that mental health is not an all or none kind of an experience. Mental health is not something you either have or you don't have. Much like our physical health, right? I can have physical health deterioration that looks very different when it starts from when it's been going on for 3 months or 6 months or 12 months, and our mental health is very much the same, right? So one of the things we're going to talk about now, just in terms of strategies and interventions, is, one of the things that we can really be doing ourselves and helping each other to do is really minding our mental health in this very active, daily, non-judgmental kind of a fashion, right? I kind of think about sort of taking care of our mental health or our mental fitness similar to physical fitness, right? That, I probably want to go for a walk or lift some weights or go for a run or do something most days of the week, right? I know there's lots of science to back up that's going to help me help my heart, help keep weight off and obesity and endocrine outcomes. It's going to help my mental health. I'm probably going to sleep better, etc. Doing things like that on a daily basis to check in with and mind our mental health is really, really crucial to, again, opening up the space of understanding that mental health is much more of a continuum versus something that is either there or it's not there. And we really want to sort of orient people to kind of, changing the conversation in mental health around that. I certainly know for myself, my generation, I'm in my 40s, and certainly generations that came before me, and probably, even the one, but, below me, we didn't talk about mental health, right? Like, this is all new stuff. I hear what my nieces and nephews learn in school, and they have whole conversations and education around emotions and meditation and things like that. We just simply didn't have those conversations, right? And so there's a whole part of our Canadian community that's playing a lot of catch up, right? And a lot of this is kind of, in some ways, sort of foreign, right? I mean, I know that, growing up in my generation and in my family, it was a very much a kind of like, suck it up, take it on the chin, and, just keep moving forward, look for the solution and keep moving forward. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I actually think that's a really important skill for us to have, so long as it's balanced with the other stuff, right? And the other stuff is the balancing act of going, okay, so I'm doing what I can to move forward with the challenges and adversities I'm facing in my life, like the pandemic. And it's also probably okay for me to develop a bit of a practice and a habit of spending some time checking in and finding out really, how am I doing, right? What is happening for me on an emotional level, right? Do I feel, if I actually slow down and tune in, would there be things there for me to pay attention to, right? Because oftentimes that's all we need, right? Oftentimes it's just really the ability to acknowledge that maybe I'm actually not okay. Like, maybe today I am having a difficult day or I'm having a difficult week. Because if I can tune in and realize that, sometimes what that mobilizes us to do is maybe take some different action, but lots of times reach out for connection, right? And when we think about, human civilization and how we've survived, and we think about now what actually is one of the most important ingredients in getting through adversities, it's the connections that we're going to form with other people and maintain with other people, which we know has been so challenged during COVID, right? So continuing to have this ability to kind of check back in, find out how I'm doing. And again, I keep using this term non-judgmental, right? Where if you actually tune in and go, yeah, I am having a tough day, our job there is not to get critical of ourselves and go, why am I feeling that way? Come on, let's go, right? Like, it's to go, oh, okay, that's how I'm feeling today. And is there anything that this informs for me about what I might need to do to take care of myself? Is it that I need to go for a walk? Is it that I need to get on a Zoom call with my grandchildren? I don't know, right? But kind of use that as data to inform us that, yeah, there's a little bit of an erosion here. And can I take some productive and proactive steps to move that forward? I'm going to pause, Kelly. I can get going. And
I know, and there's like so much more I can ask you, but one of the things that we do in Wayfound, which is in the BOSS program, which is the before operational stress that we teach across the country to first responders everywhere, is really about how the brain functions, right? And when we go through a thinking process, an emotion, a behavior, can you sort of link all those together? Like when we have a thought process, sort of what happens, the roads we have and choices we can go down.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I'll just kind of carry on with the thread that I was just speaking to. So like, let's say you were to kind of do a little bit of a check-in with yourself and kind of notice, I'm not feeling that great today. And your immediate thought was, you're such a wimp. What's wrong with you? Let's get going. Well, we have to understand that that thought, right, has all sorts of interconnectedness with the rest of our body, with our emotional and sort of psyche, if we call it that. So if I think that to myself, God, you're such a loser, right? What am I likely going to feel, right? I'm probably going to feel angry with myself. Shame, right, is probably a pretty common one. And we have to understand that the thoughts and how they influence emotion is also then going to influence our behavior, right? So if I've just been really critical of myself and I've now sort of activated this, shame, embarrassed, angry kind of a response, I'm going to probably not be all that inclined to talk to someone. I'm going to feel sort of embarrassed maybe, and I might kind of close myself off a little bit, right? I might sort of go, oh, I'm having such a bad day. I don't want to talk to anyone. I'm not going to answer the phone. I'm not going to get on the computer. I'm not going to respond to emails. I'm going to kind of sit here and we can get really trapped into this loop where the thoughts we're having influences the continued emotions, continues, to experience our behavior. And then they're reciprocal, right? So if I'm sitting at home and, kind of stewing and what have you, well, that's going to fuel more, difficult emotion and probably keep that self-critical narrative going, right? Whereas if I, notice that I'm not feeling that well and I go, okay, well, that's understandable. This is a really tough time, right? How am I likely going to feel? I'm probably going to feel neutral, right? I might actually feel, a little comforted, right? And maybe a sense of sort of self-compassion of like, yeah, this is a really difficult time. And that actually might motivate my behavioral reactions, right? That might motivate me to go, okay, Megan, like treat yourself like a 5-year-old. It's okay to have a bad day. It's okay to have a bad week. You've got a lot going on. What can you do that's, sort of productive to help yourself, right? And again, I might go out for that walk or play with my puppy or call my mom. I don't know, right? But I'm probably going to be more inclined to do something that is about taking care of myself, right? So the thing that we want you to understand and to see and maybe to take away is that it's actually, if you can develop a little bit of a habit around this, it actually can become, easier over time to just pay attention to what am I telling myself? Can I notice that what I tell myself influences, what I'm experiencing emotionally? And then can I also notice the sort of ways that influences my behavior? Because if I'm stuck, right, if I'm feeling like I'm just week on week really struggling and it's not getting any better, I have multiple entry points there. I can try to challenge my thinking. I can actually start to do things behaviorally. I can maybe, sort of attend to my emotions differently. And we might find that actually moves us forward from the difficult place that we're in. So there's this really consistent and ongoing relationship between our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior, because they kind of go in a triangle. And that's a takeaway that we would offer to you to kind of start to tune into. And again, the more practice we can put towards this, oftentimes the better we can get at intervening.
Excellent. It's such great and easy. I mean, it sounds so easy, but it's not so easy, but it certainly gets people thinking, and awareness being such a critical part of the very first step of all of this too. Would you offer any other strategies, just maybe specifically to anxiety and depression? Because I know sometimes when people are feeling anxious or depressed, all of those things, those restorative physiological things that you talked about, which is, eating a healthier, going for a walk, aren't always possible for them.
Right. Absolutely. No, I really appreciate that. So, yeah. And Kelly, you just said something that's so important, which is kind of the awareness of these things. And I'm really fond of saying that we can't change anything that we're not aware of. Right. So the couple of things we've already given you, this sort of way to check in, and now a bit of a strategy to look at your thoughts and emotions and behaviors. This is about building awareness, and it's starting to maybe give you some ideas of what to take forward. When we're talking about anxiety specifically, we need to understand that anxiety, and I'm no stranger to it, is really about living in the future, right? Anxiety is about worry. It's about what could happen next, right? And it really takes us out of the present moment. So a quick and kind of dirty strategy that I like to use when I notice that I'm feeling anxious, right, is to really try to get specific. Like, what am I actually saying to myself? What am I actually worried could happen, right? Typically for me, it's that, some catastrophic thing is going to happen and I'm going to lose everything, right? That's a pretty common place my mind goes to. What I have to do is go, okay, I'm feeling anxious. Let's be non-judgmental about that. And then I have to go, okay, do I actually have any evidence to support the conclusion that my mind has given me? Because probably I don't. And so, if I can sort of recognize that I'm thinking really catastrophically, I can start to go, okay, what's my evidence? And if I don't have any, is there any other perspective on what I'm worried about than that the bottom is going to fall out? And then I actually try to make that specific for myself, that no, I probably don't have evidence that that bad thing is going to happen. And I've handled difficult things, many, many times in my life. I have lots of competency I can draw on. And so if something difficult or bad happens, I can trust that I'm going to be able to find my way through it. And what that also does is it allows us to come back into the present moment. So, given that we've all been stuck at home and have been limited in our social interactions and so on, one of the things that I think we can all actually really help ourselves to do is start to develop what's called a mindfulness or a present moment sort of set of discipline, let's call it. There was some research that came out of Harvard this fall, actually, that said that even doing 10-minute mindfulness breaks per day, and those can be broken up into chunks. So even 2 5-minute mindfulness practices. This actually was showing in this study the ability to influence neurogenesis and changing of neural pathways, right? So I know everybody, it's like the buzzword, meditate, meditate. I like the science behind it, right? And the science tells me that actually if we could develop a habit, 5 or 10, 10 minutes a day in 5-minute chunks, that actually really helps our minds. It helps our minds to calm down, which makes it then less likely that we're going to be living in, the anxiety-filled future, right? So that would be one thing that I would recommend that people can do at home morning and night and just start to build into their schedules. When we're talking about depression, right, oftentimes what we're talking about is regret about the past. And we're talking about things that we are feeling that we lost and feeling that those losses and that regret is going to perpetuate and become part of our future, right? So one of the things we need to do or understand about depression is that it really influences us to shut down. It sort of, facilitates what's called behavioral inactivation. And so one of the things we need to do with depression is we need to get up and moving, right? Which again, in the pandemic has been extremely difficult. We've all been sitting around watching Netflix baking bread, right? So it's challenging, but there's nothing to say that, even going for, a walk around the outside of your house or up and down your stairs, or even doing 10 jumping jacks in your living room, right? I know they sound silly, but these are actually things that get us moving. And not only do they get us moving and do all those kinds of helpful things for our body, but what that does for us psychologically is it gives us a sense that there is something I can do. I don't just have to sit here on my couch watching Netflix eating bread until such time that I'm told I can leave my house again, right? I want to be really clear, right? Doing 10 jumping jacks in my living room is not going to be the panacea, right? The cure-all for everything. But what we're talking about is, the small and meaningful things that we can do throughout the day that help us to get through a period of adversity like we've been going through with the pandemic.
Excellent ideas for people to take away too. And one of the things you mentioned when we were getting ready for this was some current research on what they call post-traumatic growth. Can you tell us what that is, and so people understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so happy to talk about post-traumatic growth in this conversation, and certainly in my work as a whole. So again, as a trauma therapist, my work across my career has actually been looking at things related to post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth is this idea that we can all, as a human species, we have an incredible capacity to go through, unbelievable adversity and still actually be able to emerge on the other side of that adversity, not just kind of having survived it, but we actually have the ability to evolve and grow to a place that we simply could not have gotten to had we not gone through that adversity, right? And as a trauma therapist, as a person, I find that to be a really encouraging and important message, right? That we can go through this pandemic, we can go through, a life-threatening situation, we can go through trauma, right? Like we can actually do that. And it's not just about surviving it, we can actually thrive, right? We actually have the ability to kind of grow and develop, and there can be something transformational about that process. Now, one of the things we need to understand about post-traumatic growth is that you don't actually have to be resolved in terms of the difficult parts of trauma to actually start experiencing the growth. So the two things can happen in tandem, right? I can be feeling anxious and uncertain about my future and struggling with sleep. And at the same time, as I'm recovering and working those things through, I'm actually facilitating, increasing the chances that I'm growing and evolving through that process. One of the most significant predictors of post-traumatic growth, sort of regardless of adversity that we look at. So if we look at, people who have been diagnosed with cancer, or people who have lost a child, or different things like this. One of the most significant predictors of if someone's going to report post-traumatic growth is having at least one person. And I think this is such an important point. It's one person in their life where they actually feel like they can sort of drop the armor and be authentic. Right. So if I've got 100 people in my world, whether at work or acquaintances, friends, whatever, and I've got one person that I can go, you know what, today I'm really not doing okay, right? And receive some validation, receive some support. That actually is predictive of my ability to experience that growth and evolution that I'm talking about, right? So, when we talk about the importance of social support, I think sometimes that can be a really overwhelming kind of construct or idea, like, oh, I've got to have this social circle and what have you. Well, what if you don't have that many friends? What if you're kind of more introverted, right? Well, right, just having that one person, it's about the authenticity of the relationship versus having all of these different kind of social areas to engage in, right? One of the other predictors of post-traumatic growth is something that we call productive rumination. So it means that when you're thinking about the struggles and like what we've gone through in the pandemic and the losses and all of these things, we want to try to do it in a way that is keeping ourselves mindful of, and so where am I hoping I can get to? What am I hoping is going to be the other side of this, right? What, if I'm worrying about this thing or regretting this thing, what are some things that I can do to try to, sort of draw some meaning about what this means for my life, right? So, I hope that maybe on the other end of the pandemic, we're going to emerge from this maybe with a different understanding about the importance of community and how we stay connected to one another. I think that's entirely possible, right? And these are some of the things that we can try to keep in mind.
But really, it's just fascinating. I think what's interesting too for a lot of people is we talk about trauma as it's like one big horrible thing that happened to somebody, when really it can be from the time you're a little person, and accumulative things that happen, and that is trauma too. And if we don't sort of manage our childhood experiences, sometimes they follow us into our adulthood and affect our life significantly.
You got it. Absolutely, Kelly. Right. And I think that's such an important point. Like, we know that single incident trauma, like a sexual assault or a motor vehicle accident or something, like there are events we can go through that are sufficient enough to kind of thrust us into psychological decline. Right. But you're absolutely right. More often than not, we're talking about, generational transmission of trauma, right? Like, my parents, right, they both came from, families where both parents were alcoholics, and there's lots of trauma in their lives and what have you. Well, they brought that into parenting me and my brothers, and, they did fine, right? There's no sort of blame or what have you, but there's ways that influence their parenting style, right? And I think it's, again, normalizing and validating. It's okay for us to know that that's the case, right? I know that even though my parents had flaws and foibles, they did absolutely the best they could, and they were great parents. But I know there was some generational transmission of stuff they experienced that then got passed down into how they parented, right? And I think that's actually more the norm, right? This is, again, one of these myths we need to bust about mental health, is that, guess what? We all have mental health struggles, right? Some of us, absolutely more significant, more severe, but we all struggle, right? We all have stories and baggage and things that have impacted us in positive and negative ways, right? And what I really love about this post-traumatic growth construct and literature is that it tells us that actually is part of what helps us to become the humans we're supposed to become, right? It's not about avoiding and preventing trauma and you're hopelessly sentenced if you are, if you have these things happen to you. No, actually, this is the stuff that is actually about being a human being, and it's how we resolve, connect with one another, learn about ourselves that actually matters as we move forward.
That's great. Great answer. I'm going to ask you one more question before we sort of turn it back to
Sure.
Susan and Sally, and it's more about the future of mental health care in Canada, because, we've identified it as a pandemic of its own almost. And yet, we still use old traditional ways of dealing with it for a lot of people, and a lot of those things aren't working, but there's new research and new ways of doing things like psychedelic medicine and that are coming along that seem to have such promising outcomes for people that are struggling, that have not been able to resolve their problems. So can you talk a little bit about the sort of psychedelic medicine that's coming along with psychotherapy, and just
sure,
let people
yeah,
know?
for sure.
It's very newsworthy.
Yeah. And I'll try to be very brief because I know we're running out of time. But things that I would say, and again, like what we've been talking about today around kind of this continuum experience and really recognizing that mental health is not all or none. Some of the things that are going to influence and impact our mental health industry moving forward is that we have to be doing more around in early identification and prevention. And I think we're going to see massive influence in those sort of areas in the mental health industry moving forward. And we certainly are looking at that within Wayfound. In terms of psychedelic medicines, man, I tell you, I am so thrilled to be a clinician at this moment in history, because we are starting to actually find some medicines, plant-based medicines, that are having unbelievable impact and outcomes for the people who are struggling with, palliative anxiety, depression, addiction, PTSD, etc. I was just in a group yesterday where we were using a psychedelic medicine with one of my patients who I've seen for 5 years. And I've seen things happen for him in the last 3 weeks that we haven't been able to even come close to in 5 years of treatment. So, I mean, I think, there's I guess, some controversy around the psychedelics, and we need to ensure that they are, rolled out and we understand them. And there's a lot of scientific rigor and tremendous ethical practice surrounding them. But that is a real beacon of hope, I think, in the face of a mental health crisis here in Canada, North America, and the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. The future is definitely changing for that. So I know we've got questions, I'm sure. So I'm going to turn it back to Susan and Sally, and we'll get to the questions. But thank you very much, Dr. Megan. You're awesome as usual.
You too, Kelly. Thank you for doing this with me.
Okay, wow. That is an awful lot of information to absorb. And Dr. Megan and Kelly, thank you so much for your presentation today. You've really kind of identified the hidden challenges of COVID and the aftermath that this thing is going to leave in its wake. And I think many of us don't really fully understand or maybe recognize what we're facing. So thank you for giving us all of that insight, and especially for all of those tips. My takeaway is I think I can use a lot of that, because even though I don't really have any problems, it's still kind of a crazy situation for us. Anyway, you're contributing so much to the health and well-being of everybody out there. And all I can say is to anybody out there that needs help, please don't hesitate to reach out. There's no shame in it. If you need it, get it. I hate the line, but we're all in this together. Thank you. We'll start our Q&A session in a moment, but right now, please mark your calendars for April 15th, when Tom Sampson, who is the retired chief of the CEMA, which is the Calgary Emergency Management Agency, will be speaking with us about what really goes on behind the scenes of a Calgary emergency. Think, for instance, the flood of 2013. So who are you going to call? Tom Sampson. So thank you for that. And Vincent, over to you for Q&A.
Who are you going to call? Tom Sampson. That's going to stick with me, Sally. That's going to stick with me. So hello, everyone. My name is Vincent. I'm the membership chair for the Canadian Club of Calgary, and just wanted to walk you through a couple of things. I see that Carol has raised her hand in the chat. If you'd like to add a question, just pop it into the Q&A, into the chat function. It's, if you're on PC or Mac, it's just at the bottom. It's the two little bubbles in Q&A, and you can submit questions through there. You can also use the chat feature if you feel more comfortable just to send something to the various panelists. So one element to this is we're going to be interviewing both Dr. Megan and Kelly, because they're both esteemed experts in this field and arena. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion. And as we have questions coming in, I'm going to just dive right into it with some of our pre-supplied ones. So one element of this has been a generational shift in how we talk about mental health. As a millennial, I am 30 years young. My generation has been much maligned in saying that we seek out safe spaces, that we are mentally weaker than 30 years ago. Dr. Megan Kelly, are we as hardy as a group now than, say, 20, 30 years ago? Has there actually been a shift, or is this society shifting? Like, what's your thoughts about this generational trend?
I can go first, Kelly, and I'd be interested in any of your thoughts. I think it's more complicated than saying that, the group now is less hardy and we were more hardy before. I mean, you have to sort of, I think, consider world events, right? I mean, a lot of folks who paved the way for my generation, they experienced the Depression and world wars and different things like this, right? So I mean, those of course have massive impact. The pandemic is going to have impact on children who were born during the pandemic, right? So I think what we need to understand is that probably what influences mental health, depending on the generation, is a lot of what's happening in the world, right? I would say that sure, maybe there was a hardiness to my generation, the generation that came before me, but we're also in the midst of a mental health crisis. So is it possible that there was some trade-off of that hardiness relative to how people were taking care of their mental health, right? So I think it's a bit broader than that. I think the generations coming up now, the millennials or whatever, whenever things change like this and there's things that are unfamiliar, it's natural to have a pushback against it, right? But the fact of the matter is, we're going to find out. The millennials talking about things the way that they have, demanding more attention to their mental health and being taken care of and having respectful workplaces and things like that. This is influencing massive social and cultural changes we're seeing, right? Me Too movements and talking about racism a different way and all these kinds of things. That change doesn't happen unless people are pushing and sort of pushing the envelope. But we're not necessarily going to understand, was this better or worse for us for another generation or so, right? I think what we can do, and again, it kind of is fitting with the talk we've already had, we can give ourselves the gift of being present, right? And trying to be curious about our presence and sort of what's happening around us versus casting blame, judging it, saying one's better than the other.
Yeah, and just I would add to that in my generation, because I'm another generation or two ahead of Megan, is that in when we were growing up, there was no early detection, there was no prevention. Everything was, you dealt with it once it became a problem, whether it was heart disease or cancer or mental health. So I think we're seeing a shift there, which is great, to looking at things earlier, like what can we do earlier? Can we teach people more about their mental health and how they understand it, as well as their physical health? So I think that's a big shift that is really great for the future right now.
Yeah. So my next question is, and this might be more weighted towards Kelly, what is virtual healthcare? Because multiple provincial governments across the country are making various investments, some effective, some very not effective, but what is virtual healthcare? How can it transform our healthcare system? And what's the utility of it? And can you explain the concept to us?
Happily, yes. Virtual healthcare is definitely here to stay. First of all, it is where you can actually interact with health professionals, whether it's physicians, psychologists, nurses, even physiotherapy can be done virtually to some extent, which is quite interesting. But it's the ability to interact with people not face to face, eyeball to eyeball, if you like. So you can do it on Zoom, you can do it on multiple platforms, you can do it just even by phone calls. But it's when you go to your doctor, for example, and I did it in the medical world. We figured 80% of what you go to see a physician for can actually be done virtually. So asking the right questions, just like they would do sitting in an office, and giving the right answers can actually diagnose a lot of things. So there's definitely some things that need to be hands-on. Did you break a bone? Did you do some of those sorts of things? Definitely hands-on kind of care. But 80% of what you go to a physician for can actually be done in a virtual environment. There's even now things you can take blood pressure at home and report them back to your physician, your temperature, oximeters. Like there's all kinds of home devices now that people have that they can just interact with their physician by phone or by Zoom or, usually it's a private platform so that there's a lot of privacy around it. And it is going to be transforming medicine in the future. It is here to stay. It's very cost effective for the healthcare system, but it's also very time effective for the people that need it. So instead of traveling to a doctor's office, waiting in a waiting room with sick people and seeing a doctor for 5-10 minutes, you can actually do all that from your home in 5 or 10 minutes, getting that same kind of response. They can prescribe medications. They can do a lot of things just from a virtual kind of care. And I think all provincial governments will head that way. Currently, there's a lot of private companies that are offering it, mostly to the corporations and their employees.
And I'll tag on to that I would agree. There's such an amount of things that can be done from a psychological and mental health standpoint as well, virtually. And I think one of the benefits we're going to see to that is, like we've been talking around with early identification and prevention, if you can do some of these things from home, you can connect with a psychologist expert, let's say from the comfort of your home quickly, right? I think one of the things that's going to happen in mental health as we move forward is the whole paradigm is going to shift, right? So rather than having to, pay a relatively, significant amount of money to go and sit down with a psychologist for an hour, people might be, more inclined to do a subscription-based service where they pay a certain amount a month, $35 a month, I don't know, but they have a suite of sort of mental health services they're able to access.
So one element throughout the conversation has been bringing an understanding towards mental health and equipping some of our members with some of the tools to think about their own mental health. But Dr. Megan, say our membership is heavily involved in the community. They're on boards, they're volunteering regularly. They're some of the most impressive people I've ever met. If they see someone struggling, what are 3 tips you can give to them that can make this presentation relevant to them doing an intervention or support, or how do they be that support person for someone that could be struggling?
Great question. I love it. Let me say this. You've heard the expression, it's lonely at the top. Let me just tell you that from a psychological perspective, man, is that true? We know that the more people advance in their careers, the more accomplished they are, the more boards they sit on, the more letters they have beside their name, whatever the case may be. Actually, the harder and harder and harder it gets for them to talk about struggling from a mental health perspective, right? Because there's this notion that I am all these things, I do all these things, I should be okay. So for this exceptionally accomplished group of people, I think really resetting and understanding that people may not actually be doing as great as they seem to be, right? There's a lot of pressure people feel with giving a forward-facing impression of having everything together, and a lot of times behind the scenes, it's a different story. So what I would encourage people to take away is if you're asking someone how they are, right? We do this as a social convention. Oh, hey Kelly, how are you, right? But if you're asking and you really want to be supported from a mental health perspective, mean the question, right? Really want to understand how the person is. And so a lot of time what that is it's slowing down the pace of our interactions. It's slowing down how we engage with one another, right? Because if I actually want to know how you're doing or how Kelly's doing, I actually want to have 5 minutes to listen, right? And then I think the other thing that is really important for us to take away, especially when people are really accomplished and they're go-getters and they know how to do things, is that we have to resist the urge to solve people's problems. Right? If you can understand that people may have a bit of a mask that they wear and start to really ask the question about how people are doing with sincerity in a way that you really want to understand the answer, be prepared simply to listen. And that is a skill and something that is challenging for a lot of us to do, because we want, when we see people hurting or we hear them struggling, we want to leap into action. Let's do this, let's do that. Have you thought about this? What about try that? And that is 95% of the time not what people need. What people need simply is to be seen, heard, and an attempt to be understood, right? So, there's lots of reading out there we can do on the art of active listening, but those are just really simple things that we can take away, and it doesn't have to be really, really complicated, right? The quality of our interactions is actually exceptionally predictive to how our mental health is going to be over time, and that is particularly relevant for people who seemingly need to have it together all the time.
Agree. But being authentic is crucial when you're when you're trying to help others, I think, in situations. Yeah.
So another concept that was highlighted through the presentation was the idea of trauma. And the only way I'm familiar with it is with the ACEs score and various elements there. You're nodding your heads. Can you tell me more about the ACEs score? Like, what? Tell me about, but also, if you can, also tell me about trauma-informed care. So those 2 concepts, because we're probably going to be dealing with a fair amount of traumas through COVID, but also previous stuff that came to a head. So can you share and engage in those 2 concepts?
Yeah, well, Kelly, why don't you start? Because you know a lot about the
Story,
ACEs.
yes.
Yeah.
Quick story to tell you. The ACE score, that it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So that's what ACE stands for. And it was actually designed by an internist in California by the name of Dr. Vincent Folletti. with Kaiser Permanente group of hospitals. And he did it actually trying to help people that were trying to lose weight and not losing weight. You know, they lose 20, gain 20, lose 20. So going back in the history of their childhood experiences really informed him on the trauma that people were going through that were never resolved. So it became a standard of questionnaire, I guess, for people when they're trying to help them, whether it's in a mental health situation or in a medical situation. So ACE has become a really good standard and it's very effective. But Megan's worked way more with it than I have. So I'll turn it over to you, Megan, to talk a little bit more about it.
No, I appreciate that, Kelly. And I think it's so important to kind of understand that that's where it came from, that there were these sort of health outcomes that seem to be connected to these adverse childhood experiences. And that was a really curious and interesting way for this construct or idea to develop. You know, in the psychological world, from a mental health standpoint, you know, the more adverse childhood experiences someone had, the more predictive it is that they are going to struggle with things like depression, anxiety, addictions, as they get into adolescence, late adolescence, and into adulthood. So that's really informative for us, I think, because we need to understand that, you know, that notion that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, like, isn't true after a certain point, right? You know, when we talk about trauma and post-traumatic growth, remember, one of the things that is key and elemental in that process is productive rumination, making meaning out of the experience, having, you know, social support to connect with. So if you're a child moving, you know, across the course of development and you don't have those things, that's where trauma becomes really toxic and really unhealthy, okay? I think from a trauma-informed care perspective, and I think being trauma-informed communities, my humble opinion, you know, if somebody wanted to sort of ask me that, is that I think everything from a mental health perspective is about trauma. I think it's about ways that people have had losses, attachment disruptions, times where they have been threatened and their security has been disrupted, that they have not had the proper validation support and ability to kind of process and work through. So, you know, when the people I see in my clinical practice, it all boils down to trauma, right? So I think it's, you know, for us to sort of be healthy as individuals, I think we do have to have sort of a fearless ability to take almost like a personal inventory, right? The things that happened to me, you know, can I acknowledge that maybe they had an impact on me greater and more so than I think they did? And that's really relevant to trauma-informed care, right? We have to assume, I think, that people who are presenting to primary care, who are coming into psychology clinics, whatever the case may be, they have a story about trauma. And we need to understand that story about trauma, and especially when trauma is unprocessed, it wreaks havoc on the body. It disrupts the nervous system and the stress response in the brain. And that has any number of sequelae to endocrine problems, metabolic problems, cardiovascular issues, so on and so forth, right? The number of people I see in my practice who are referred from, you know, physiotherapists because they're having pelvic floor difficulties or they're having chronic migraines or the case may be, these kinds of things, they all boil down to trauma. So I think whatever sort of area of medicine or healthcare you're practicing, you know, being trauma informed really means coming from that lens, understanding that there's a way to interpret the struggles or the difficulties that the person is having, or maybe problematic behaviors they're presenting with from that trauma-informed perspective. So, you know, it kind of, I think what it can help us to do is actually have more compassion for the people that we're attempting to treat, right? Even when people are really challenging to engage with.
And I just want to add a little bit there, because I worked in medicine, you know, the 40 years of my career. And you look at family physicians and that, and they have some mental health training, but they don't have a lot of mental health training, you know, so they're always looking for places to refer their patients to where they can get the care, and the system is backed right up. So there's a lot of need out there still for people, especially coming through cardiovascular problems, that really need some psychological care as well. So they go hand in hand. The head is not disconnected from the body. So.
And one of the things that we do a lot within Wayfound, and that I would also suggest is really important, is we try to work at trauma-informing organizations, right? So we do quite a bit of trauma-informed leadership and working with, you know, firefighting departments and police organizations to help their leadership be trauma-informed, really understand, you know, how trauma is likely going to show up in their workforce, right? Because again, it takes it out of maybe the, you know, problematic employees and helps us to understand that, you know, this actually may be a mental health need and a psychological sort of connection that's required.
So, with 5 minutes to the end of the event, what could you say is the one big takeaway from today's presentation?
You know, I think for me, it really is. I'm gonna use a twofold answer if that's okay. um, you know, the first takeaway is that it is really okay and understandable, and you know, we can give ourselves permission to acknowledge that this is a struggle, right? That is a gift we can give ourselves, is just to be honest, right? Just to be true and curious about our experience, and give ourselves permission to not be okay, right? We don't need to kind of walk around in this state of sort of toxic positivity looking to be grateful all the time. It's okay to not be okay, right? That's a really important takeaway, because that's going to inform how we then take care of ourselves. And then the next takeaway would just be, if you don't have one, start to think about, what does your daily mental fitness program look like, right? What are some things that you can do that helps you to mind your mental health?
That's two good ones. Mine would just be, when you're talking with others, be very authentic and listen carefully to what they're telling you. Yeah.
Well, excellent. So thank you two for joining us here at the Canadian Club of Calgary. We're a catalyst for conversations about being Canadian here in the city, and you've both presented something absolutely excellent, not only for the benefit of the city writ large, but also to our members. So again, thank you so much for coming and not only engaging with each other and having a great conversation, but also, you know, taking our questions from the club.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting us or including us. This was really fun. I don't get to do stuff like this very often, so it's really quite a treat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We try to.
Way. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. So we try to make it a bit more fun. We try to make it a bit more engaging. We've been on plenty of webinars this COVID season. It's a lot of, you know, direct to camera, and you know, and it's, you know, basically reading of the notes. When you have a conversation, when you're chatting and there's a Q&A, it helps, right?
Totally. And you were a great facilitator, and I always love the opportunities to connect with Kelly. So this was just top notch. Thank you very much.
So I'm gonna demote you back to an attendee,
Hey.
and then I have a closing message to give to folks. So
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So hello everybody. So as folks are exiting from the webinar, we have a survey. It's going to be circulated. This is a new thing for us still. You know, we're about 7 months in, 6 events in, using Zoom as a tool to engage with both members, but also the wider public. So fill out the survey. We're taking any and all feedback. Next, we have Tom Sampson with SEMA, recently retiring with almost, you know, a quarter century of experience in emergency response. So how do we react to the next flood? How do we do that? How do we not only react to extreme weather events like the hailstorm that ripped through the northeast of Calgary? So those pieces and those elements, he has multiple decades of experience, and he's being freed from his position so he can give us some good answers. So that's going to be next month, and you can check out that at www.canadianclubcalgary.ca. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for engaging in this really important conversation, not only for the city, but Canada writ large. Thank you for participating in the Q&A. And if you have any questions, concerns, otherwise, please drop us an email, send us a note, www.canadianclubcalgary.ca. Next, thank you to the members that joined us today. The only way that we've been able to actually be able to run this programming, pay for Zoom and Zoom webinar, do social media advertising, completely change our database so that we can renew memberships online and whatever, what have you, but also do RSVPs through our website. The only way we were able to do that and pivot during COVID was because of members, because of those annual dues that allowed us not only the resiliency, but strength to actually jump right back into the action when adversity struck at the beginning of COVID. So, you know, bluntly, because even though there's a pandemic on, the conversation should continue. So thank you again for joining us. Please respond to the survey. Check out our event with Mr. Sampson next month. It's going to be fantastic. And thank you for being part of the conversation.